RetroTech for $40? Yes, please.
What's in the box?
So what I'm unpacking here is the PhotoPhone, made by Image Data Corporation of San Antonio, Texas. Sounds like something you'd order from Sharper Image, convinced it would change your life, and then immediately wonder if you misunderstood the instructions. Back in the 1980s, this was a device that could actually send images over a standard phone line. Not Wi-Fi, not fiber, just the same phone line that made long-distance calls feel like a financial decision. The company was co-founded in 1983 by inventor David Monroe, and this thing is basically the great-grandparent of your camera phone. Except instead of selfies, it was used for teleradiology, meaning doctors could look at medical images from far away and then thoughtfully say things like, "Oh, that doesn't look good." This specific unit is the PhotoPhone CP220, released in November of 1985, back when image compression was less of a feature and more of a hopeful suggestion, and it worked, slowly, painfully, but it worked. The catch was the price. It was around $8,500, which in 1985 money translates to only hospitals, universities, and people who say the word procurement. So while this technology helped pave the way for modern digital imaging and fiber optics, at the time, it mostly paved the way for one guy in a lab coat saying, "Oh, okay, don't touch anything, though. The image is coming in." We fire up the machine and immediately hope that saying "fire it up" does not result in an actual fire. This PhotoPhone was sold to us as being in working condition, and for a brief optimistic moment, that still appears to be true. For $39.95 plus tax plus shipping, we've either scored an unbelievable retro bargain or purchased evidence from an unresolved situation. At first I was worried. There was no operator's manual, which felt irresponsible for a machine that looks like it could legally issue commands. But it turns out the entire manual is built into the system itself, complete with extremely verbose help screens that explain every single function, whether you asked for it or not. It even details the ability to dial out using POTS, aka the plain old telephone system, the same one we all used back in the days of yore when making a phone call involved commitment. Hardware-wise, this thing is a greatest hits album of 1985. There's a 720K floppy disk drive and controller, a period-correct modem card that's probably 1200 or 2400 baud, and a dedicated video card to drive this absolutely groovy 9-inch monochrome monitor display. Around the back, you've got RCA composite video in and out, plus a larger camera connector that I'm sure was standard in 1985 and impossible to replace now. Up front, there's a brightness knob and the classic 12-button phone keypad, which I suspect was included to really sell the phone part of PhotoPhone, because typing anything with it feels like filing taxes one number at a time. Now, remember when I said this was sold as a fully working device of somewhat mysterious origin? Well, think again, because right now I'm seeing what appears to be a plume of golden smoke coming out of the back of the machine, and I'm immediately regretting my earlier optimism. Somewhere inside this medieval device, a component has released the magic smoke, and as we all know, once that smoke escapes, it's not going back in. So let's crack it open and find out exactly which part of this machine decided it was done participating. After removing the top panel, I don't immediately see anything obvious, which is never comforting. Inside you can see the inner workings of the monitor, 3 expansion cards, a very small motherboard, and somewhere deep inside, like a shameful secret, there's probably a power supply. 9 times out of 10, when vintage electronics let out magic smoke, it's a capacitor. This exact thing happened during our Taito Space Invaders restore, thanks to a tantalum capacitor, so naturally that's where my suspicion immediately goes. We start pulling cards, so we can get a closer look. The first card out is the floppy disk controller, produced by Zitronix apparently. Every attempt to research this company mostly turns up soldering equipment, plus a vague mention of contract manufacturing services, which sounds like corporate code for a, "Hey, we made this, but please don't ask follow-up questions." Next up is the video controller, which handles all the on-screen magic via composite video. I immediately notice a BNC connector on the video input, which I remove because we prefer RCA connectors whenever possible. Dragon's Lair gets to use BNC connectors because it's extra special. There's also another Zitronix sticker here, which pretty much confirms this entire system was custom built specifically for Image Data Corporation, The card is dated 1986, meaning this machine was produced not long after its debut, back when state-of-the-art meant, please do not bump this. The final card is very clearly the modem card. One end has a paper shield, presumably to protect it from accidental contact or judgment. There's an Image Data Corporation telephone interface sticker along with an older style FCC registration ID here. The EPS portion, that's called the grantee code, turns up absolutely nothing when I've searched for it, which feels right. It's exactly the level of mystery this machine prefers. None of the three cards show any signs of burned components, and honestly, they look almost brand new. That means we have to dig deeper, so removing the monitor chassis becomes the next step. First, we discharge the monochrome display, just in case it saved up a charge specifically to harm us. Our discharge tool is a screwdriver with a thick grounding wire clipped to the frame. If you touch anything you think might have a charge, and it discharges. Hence the name, thank you, I'll be here all week. Removing a monitor chassis is by far the most complex portion of today's hunt for the exploded component. There's wiring going into the neck of the monitor. There's wiring going into the nearby copper yoke that surrounds the neck. There's also power wires to unhook and yet another wire coming in from the video card. If you've ever wondered if us RetroTech guys experience fear when working on monitors, the answer is absolutely yes. There's a whole fear ritual we had to put up with just to get here. Whether it's touching something hot, touching something pointy, touching something that shocks you mildly, or touching something that shocks you so hard it makes you want to hire a lawyer and put all your property into a shared trust. Yeah. Now that we finally pulled the monitor chassis out, we take a good long look at inspecting it, and we still don't see anything that could have caused that smoke show we saw earlier. This is unfortunate because I can now see in the far back of the cabinet that we only have the actual floppy disk drive and the power supply left to check out. Okay, I'm going to try to remove the switching power supply since those always have plenty of pesky capacitors on them. If you look closely, you can see someone's put little red dots on the capacitors, which is a fairly standard way of knowing that this machine has had maintenance performed on it by a dude with a red Sharpie. That means all the original electrolytic capacitors from 1985-ish appear to be replaced and look very new. That doesn't bode well for our theory that a capacitor blew up. Still, we forge ahead and try to figure out how to get this thing out of here. Removing interior components was not something on the help screens that we saw earlier. Most likely, they would have wanted you to send your $8,500 custom imaging equipment back for repair at the home office, where it would surely have cost several $100 more. As it turns out, removing the switching power supply is far more difficult than expected. I can easily reach two of the screws. The other two are behind the cathode ray tube, which now also needs to come out. At this point, I'm asking myself what isn't being removed. The motherboard gets to stay. It barely has any components on it, and it looks suspiciously innocent. I pull the floppy disk drive to clear out the ribbon cable, and it eventually slides out the front after releasing itself from the machine's death grip. The drive shows no visible damage, and hey, it was manufactured by Sony, making it the first major brand component we've seen so far. If there's any problems here, they should be easy to fix. Famous last words. After unhinging the CRT, we finally access the remaining screws and remove the switching power supply. And almost immediately, there it is. One component that clearly exploded from the inside. There's 3 safety film capacitors on this board, and one of them is absolutely responsible for our recent magic smoke incident. These metallicized polypropylene film capacitors protect against AC input problems, and they were probably commonly used in machines like the Radio Shack TRS-80. The other 2 still look okay, but I don't trust them, so they're all getting replaced. I place an order with DigiKey and prepare for the most authentic part of any restoration project, waiting.
What's in the box?
Our new capacitors arrive in the mail in record time. Did I bother removing the old ones ahead of time? Absolutely not, because why do something off camera when you can do it on camera at high speed and let everyone watch you struggle? I grab my trusty Hacko desoldering gun, and I should clarify, it's gun-shaped, but it is not a gun. Please relax. Removing the 3 old film capacitors takes a bit because they were previously responsible for handling high voltage alternating current, which means there's a lot of solder and a certain amount of emotional weight attached to each joint. As I work, I try to stay calm by thinking about the glass of wine I'm going to have when this is over. I have tried drinking the wine while desoldering, and it never ends well for anyone involved. Soldering in the new capacitors is, thankfully, the easiest part. I know my soldering style receives some criticism, but that comes with the territory. Everyone has an opinion, and mine is that solder should hold and the machine should not catch fire. I get everything solidly connected to the board again and clip off the excess wire on the bottom because I have learned through experience that skipping this step leads to consequences. I once forgot to clip the excess leads on a monitor chassis because I was so excited to be finished. I believe that board is still somewhere in the attic, inside a box labeled regret. I'm speeding up the reassembly process to about 5,000 times normal speed. You're welcome. Nothing particularly interesting happens during this phase of the restoration. It's basically the reverse of disassembly, just without the frantic search for roasted components and the quiet self-reflection that comes with it. This machine is actually fairly simple, which means there aren't a lot of opportunities to mess things up. At least not creatively. Most of the cables only plug in one way, which feels like the designers were trying to protect us from ourselves. The floppy drive ribbon cable is usually the one exception because it will absolutely let you plug it in wrong and then act confused about it later. This time we got it right on the first try. So the question now is, will this thing work? And the answer is yes, it works. Let's see, did I give myself a thumbs up? There it is. Very subtle, but earned. Now that we're back in business, let's grab a media player and pipe some composite video into this thing. I happen to have my favorite film of all time, Back to the Future, on a USB stick, so naturally we're going to see how it looks playing through a machine that predates USB by several lifetimes. And there it is, Doc Brown and Marty McFly standing next to the DeLorean time machine in a parking lot in the middle of the night, calmly discussing something Doc did in his bathroom 30 years earlier, as one does. Timeless cinema. At this point, we really should track down some floppy disks and see if this thing can actually save and retrieve images, right? But first, we must clean. We were supposed to clean at the beginning of the video, but the surprise fireworks display threw off the schedule. I suspect there was once a camera mounted to the top of this machine, although there's very little historical information about it. In fact, I'm pretty sure this is the first YouTube video ever made about this device, which feels like a responsibility I was not prepared for. We use magic erasers and simple green on the plastics, Windex on the glass CRT, and then we're basically done. I was going to do some cleaning dad jokes here, but honestly, the job finished too quickly. Maybe next time I'll restore something we dig up out of the mud. I locate a box of brand new floppy disks and confidently insert one into the drive. After a brief period of confusion about how anything is supposed to be saved, I eventually find the disk utilities and attempt to format the floppy. There's some clicking, a little hopeful spinning, and then the machine delivers the ultimate womp womp with the message, "This disk is damaged." Which can't be true, it's brand new. I just took it out of the box. Surely I did not Incredible Hulk the disk during the unboxing process. Okay, let me cut to the chase. After about an hour of removing the floppy drive, reseating cables, and politely asking it if everything is okay, I discover that if I lean the floppy disk drive itself on its side, resting against the machine at an angle, it will suddenly read and write disks like nothing was ever wrong, which to me means this drive has serious alignment issues and is currently operating on vibes alone. That's not something you can casually fix. I mean, it can be repaired, but not easily, and not without turning this into a much longer video. I do manage to capture a few moments from the film onto a floppy disk, load them back exactly as you'd expect a device like this to do so, which is both impressive and deeply unsettling given the circumstances. Unfortunately, requiring the floppy drive to be propped up like that, like it's taking a nap against the side of the machine, not viable long term. So, I could replace the drive, or enter the GoTek USB floppy drive emulator. This little beast is designed to convincingly pretend it is a floppy drive, which is exactly what we need right now. It's got all the same connections as our tiny Sony drive and costs about $30, which is only mildly upsetting when you remember that's almost the same price we paid for the entire PhotoPhone. Still, we're not doing anything extreme here. We're not installing an LCD panel. We're not stuffing modern hardware inside it and calling it a day. People do that all the time, but not us. We're here for authenticity and unnecessary effort. The instructions for this thing are nearly impossible to understand, not because they're badly written, well, maybe a little, but because they assume you already know several things you absolutely do not know. I spent another hour trying to get the drive to accept its new master control program, which feels less like configuration and more like negotiation. Eventually, I'm rewarded with fun error messages like, "This disk has not been initialized or has been damaged." When I attempt to initialize it by formatting, I'm greeted with the extremely helpful message, "Assert error, status -3. What the heck does that mean? I really love how error messages never tell you what's actually wrong. They're never helpful. They're always written like the machine's disappointed in you. You don't get, "Hey, I can't find the disk." You get something like, "Status -3. That's not an explanation, that's a mood. Just tell me what happened, okay? Like, say, "I don't understand what you're asking me to do," or "The disk is fine, but I am not." Anything that helps me move forward. Because right now this error message feels less like information and more like the machine crossed its arms, sighed, and decided that this was a personal growth opportunity. Blech. At this point, progress has stalled, so I take the truck to Quick Quack Car Wash down the street to do some thinking. Not because the truck needs washing, but because motion helps the brain pretend it's being productive. This leads to some Googling about how people actually use these floppy emulators in strange non-computer situations. The overwhelming consensus is to ditch the included software entirely and install FlashFloppy, an open source firmware that immediately turns this thing into a vastly more capable device. It gives the emulator new powers and a whole menu of features I would love to explain in detail, but that's probably its own video. With FlashFloppy installed, everything changes. I tell the emulator it's a 720K floppy drive. I give it configuration it finally agrees with, and I try formatting one of the virtual disks. I watch the counter climb to 100%. I'm waiting for disappointment, and it actually works. I can now save images from an 85 PhotoPhone onto a USB stick I found on the ground, which feels like crossing a boundary that probably didn't exist until just now. So now let's take a moment to appreciate this technological marvel and look at some of the screen captures from the opening of Back to the Future. These images traveled from a modern media player through composite video into a machine from the mid-1980s onto virtual floppy disks pretending to be physical media and back out again. The system was originally designed for serious professional work, and today it's being used to display a movie intro involving a time machine and a shopping mall parking lot. So, if you enjoyed this restoration and want to see more obscure retro tech brought back to life, please consider dropping a like and maybe subscribing to the channel. And if you enjoy being startled by a notification when a video suddenly premieres, feel free to hit that bell icon as well. Thanks for watching us, and here's to making more unnecessarily complicated, deeply satisfying videos in the year ahead.